Hello and welcome to another MTG Arena video. Today we're taking a look at something a little bit different than usual. As you may know, yesterday 7 cards were banned from the standard format, just 1 month prior to rotation, so that's going to have a pretty significant impact on the standard metagame, and in today's video I want to discuss those banned cards briefly and then present a whole bunch of decks that will now be viable after the banned list announcement, also looking forward to rotation, so I'll make sure to mention which cards will rotate out so you can plan accordingly. So first, let's talk about which cards got banned. Abuel's Awakening, Kori Steelcutter, Heartfire Hero, Hopeless Nightmare, Monstrous Rage, This Town Ain't Big Enough, and Up the Beanstalk. So 7 cards banned from Standard. None of these cards would have rotated out, so they would have stayed in Standard post-rotation otherwise. And I actually made a whole PowerPoint presentation before the banned list announcement that I didn't get a chance to show you in a different video. So now I can show you that presentation, Standard, what's wrong and how do we fix it. Well, apparently banning 7 cards will do it. So the standard metagame at the most recent Pro Tour was 40% Izzet decks, 20% Azorius Omniscience, 10% Monored Aggro. This shows the play rates of some of the most played cards. Steelcutter was sitting at 43%, Monstrous Rage 56%, Stock Up 61% of all decks included it. And comparing those numbers to some pretty powerful cards here with Oko and Omnath at 69 and 72% play rate respectively. And as we all know, both of those cards were banned within a few months of being illegal, sometimes even weeks in the case of Omnath. And we can now add Kori Steelcutter to that list, being around for about 2 months in Standard. And then the top 8 was just Monored and Izzet. And then these were the win rates of all the decks at the Pro Tour. So you can have a quick look at that. Maybe that will inform the upcoming format as well. But of course, all the decks here were skewed towards trying to beat the Izzet decks of the format. So we will definitely see a very different metagame now with all the banned cards. And then talking about rotation, this is certainly still relevant for now, as we get to see which sets rotate out coming August 1st. So Dominaria United, The Brothers War, Phyrexia, March of the Machine, and Aftermath will all leave us. But we still have Wilds of Eldraine, which included some of the banned cards like Monstrous Rage and Up the Beanstalk, and every other set here will rotate early 2027, so still a couple years in Standard. And then of course Foundations, one of the sets that's a bit of an exception, as it will stay legal in Standard for 5 years up until 2030, and that's maybe also what informed their decision not to ban Omniscience and going for Abuel's Awakening instead. So the previous banned announcement was March 31st, and as we all know, it didn't change anything to Standard. Standard was flourishing apparently. And then also wanted to talk about the change in Standard rotation, since we did change from a 2-year rotation to a 3-year rotation. So that's going to have a significant impact on the Standard format as well. A lot of the cards that were banned yesterday were cards that they designed before they had the rotation in mind, although Kori Steelcutter is kind of the exception. So that's a card that they would have emergency banned apparently, even if we didn't have a scheduled ban announcement. And these were my thoughts at the time when they announced the change in Standard rotation, and my thoughts haven't really changed much on the matter. A bigger format means the power level is generally going to be higher, it's going to be more difficult for new cards to break through to the top of the meta, and that's maybe going to affect the variety of the format as well. And as we see now, needing to ban cards is part of that equation, which is never a good thing. If we take a look at the timeline of banned cards in Standard, this is now also updated with yesterday's ban announcement. We can see that there was a period where there weren't too many bans in Standard up until around 2017, which is actually when I personally started playing more paper Standard. My first deck I remember was kind of a budget Smuggler Sculptor Madness deck, and then Smuggler Sculptor was banned. Then I started playing more competitively, attending more Grand Prix, and I built the Jeskai Sahili deck, which was a pretty powerful combo deck at the time, relying on Felidar Guardian alongside Sahili. And then Felidar Guardian was banned, so then I moved to playing a Aetherworks Marvel deck, trying to cheat Ulamog into play, and then a little bit later Aetherworks Marvel was banned, so that's now 3 decks in a row that were banned, and back then I hadn't even monetized my YouTube channel, so I didn't have a steady income, and then later I switched to the Temur Energy deck, and later Attune and Rogue Refiner were also banned, so that's when I pretty much much gave up on paper standard, and I think a lot of people were in a similar boat with all the bannings around 2019, 2020. So I think just banning 7 cards at once like they did yesterday is probably the best approach, as opposed to having to ban after a couple of months and having people basically lose their entire decks time after time. And then now the candidates, which cards were potentially on the chopping block. Of course, Monstrous Rage being present in both the Izzet and Mono Red decks, already banned in Alchemy. May not seem like a big deal, but it does mean that Wizards internally thinks that the card is maybe winning too many games, since they have more data than we have available. And then the Steel Cutter, as everyone knew, was also on the cutting block as just a very powerful card with temporary lockdown rotating soon. The card's only going to get better, so that was a pretty easy decision as well. Then Omniscience I thought was going to be the more likely candidate to be banned as opposed to A Will's Awakening, but maybe it being in Foundations and without being able to reanimate it on turn 4, it's maybe less of a problem. And looking at the alternatives for A Will's Awakening, the options aren't all that great, and most of them will actually rotate out in 1 month. The Invasion, for instance, is going to be gone. There's the red-white sorcery that can reanimate enchantments for 5 mana. That's going to rotate out as well. So I think we're left with Yuna, which only reanimates end of turn. There's also the Builder's Talent, which you first need to cast for 2 mana and then activate for 5. So the options to bring back Omniscience after rotation aren't all that great. So I think I'm okay with them banning A Will's Awakening instead. Then Up the Beanstalk was going to be a problem after you ban all the red cards and after you ban the Omniscience deck, since then all these kind of rampy Overlord mid-range decks are going to take over, and it's already banned in Modern, maybe also a precedent. So that's another card that eventually got banned. It limits design space, as we can see with some of the upcoming mechanics as well, that are another way to cheat expensive cards into play on the cheap. So that's also probably part of their decision making. And then I think between Manifold Mouse and Heartfire Hero, most people thought Manifold Mouse was going to be banned between the 2 mice. I actually thought Heartfire Hero was the more likely candidate, also because it's already nerfed in Alchemy, again showing that internally they have more data showing that Heartfire Hero might be the problem. Being the 1-drop that curves into Manifold Mouse, of course, is the combo that they wanted to break up. So I think one of the 2 mice was pretty likely to go, ended up being the Heartfire Hero. Also maybe affects the red Leyline builds in Best of 3 Standard, where Leyline of Resonance isn't banned yet. And Heartfire Hero is still a role player in the various Aura decks that we see often in Best of 1. So I'm pretty happy with Heartfire Hero being the target as opposed to Manifold Mouse. There's maybe still a chance you can build a mouse deck without Heartfire Hero, but of course Archetype has taken a significant hit. Then Stock Up was the card technically with the highest play percentage at the Pro Tour. It's a good enough card draw spell to see play in Legacy, so the card is undoubtedly very powerful, but it's also the type of card that's just kind of fun to play with. You're going to have a good card draw spell in Standard, so I didn't think it was likely to get banned, and it did not end up getting banned, so I'm pretty happy with that. I did not think they were going to ban This Town Ain't Big Enough, but of course if you ban Cory Steelcutter, maybe it can become a problem, since the various Pixie decks using Town Ain't Big Enough were among the most powerful in the format before the introduction of Cory Steelcutter, and yeah, it's also a card that leads to some pretty repetitive play patterns with Stormchaser's Talent, so I'm okay with Town Ain't Big Enough being banned. I did not have Hopeless Nightmare on my radar, since I didn't even make a slide for it, but of course in conjunction with Nurturing Pixie, another powerful engine, and nowadays you can also play a black-white Pixie deck without blue, so just having the Kirin and the Pixie to bounce Nightmare and other 1-mana enchantments is pretty powerful, so I'm okay with Hopeless Nightmare being gone, especially since Obstinate Baloth is rotating out of Standard soon, which was one of the better sideboard answers to the Hopeless Nightmare engine, being able to put it in play for free. Still have the Wild Leaf Liege, but it's not quite as powerful for every archetype. So that leads us to the 7 banned cards: Steelcutter, Heartfire Hero, Monstrous Rage, Hopeless Nightmare, A Will's Awakening, Up the Beanstalk, and This Town Ain't Big Enough. So now we can finally move on from here and start discussing some of the decks that will now be functional in Standard. And there's quite a few. I've made a list of 13 decks here, I believe. I'll go over one by one, talking about how the deck looks like after rotation as well, and then what you can expect of the upcoming meta. Let's start with Gruul Delirium. And I've made a video on a very similar list a couple weeks before the Final Fantasy set got introduced. Now we do get to add Terra Magical Adept to the deck as well, as a relatively cheap way to put a lot of cards into the graveyard. Gives you a mana sink as well. And then we also added the Red Summon, a way to give creatures haste is pretty powerful, especially with Fear of Missing Out if you have Delirium enabled, so you can get multiple attack steps in. And then we want to combine that with Violent Urge to deal a ton of damage out of nowhere. Now in my previous iteration I was playing with Monstrous Rage, which of course got banned, so that potentially weakens the combo with Violent Urge a little bit, but we still have a big Trampler with the Wildfire Wickerfolk, and the core of this deck are cards from Duskmourn, which are not going to rotate out. In fact, if we take a look at which cards are rotating, it's just Seed of Hope, a cheap enabler that's somewhat replaceable, can always play more copies of Bushwhack, which was present in Foundations, and then Wrenn and Realmbreaker, also not really an essential part of this deck that you can easily replace with additional 3-drops. Now the mana base does take a pretty significant hit, with Copperline Gorge and half of the fast lands leaving us, and then Karplusan Forests and all of the pain lands leaving Standard, but we've already gotten a small preview of which cards will be in Edge of Eternities, the next Standard set, and that includes half of the Shock lands, and one of those is Stomping Ground, so this deck will get a pretty decent replacement for the mana base at least, so I think this will be a pretty powerful aggro deck for the upcoming format as well. Next up we have the Blue-Red or Vivi Cauldron deck. I did a version of this that was a little bit more combo oriented, that was also playing with Geralf. This list is based on the one that did well at the last Pro Tour, so it should be one of the top contenders in the next month before rotation. And of course the concept is still to use Agatha's Soul Cauldron to give Vivi's ability to your various creatures, so they can also make a lot of mana, and then you can use that mana to cast a bunch of card draw spells like the Dragon Hunt. There's also a bit of a discard theme to grow the Marauding Mako in this deck, and that can also pick up additional +1 counters, which then in turn synergizes with Vivi's ability and the Cauldron. There's Winter Night Stories to draw more cards, and we can harmonize it out of the graveyard, and then eventually we can set up a combo kill with a Voldaren Thrillseeker once we grow our creatures large enough, since we can also get additional counters from the Eidetic Memory. So this is a pretty cool kind of mid-range combo deck that can go off out of nowhere. We will actually lose Voldaren Thrillseeker with the upcoming rotation, so we won't have that finisher anymore, and then in the mana base we also lose Sheevan Reef, but overall most of the deck's core will stay the same, and we might find something to replace the Thrillseeker with. So I think this will be one of the top contenders for the next month, and then after rotation we'll see where the deck ends up, but you still have that powerful Cauldron plus Vivi engine. Then we move on to the Jeskai Oculus list, which is pretty similar to the Vivi Cauldron deck in that it also has that discard package with Marauding Mako and the Fear of Missing Out. There's Dragon Hunt and Eidetic Memory to grow our threats, but instead of doing stuff with Agatha's Soul Cauldron and Vivi, instead this deck wants to discard Abhorrent Oculus ideally, and then cheaply bring it back using cards like Helping Hand, and at 2 mana there's Recommission, and then there's some other powerful 3-drops here with Light Shatter, the Scholar, and then we can also try Joshua from the Final Fantasy set as another card that can help us discard and draw, and those can also all set up the Eidetic Memory to give us additional +1 counters. So this deck does lose quite a few pieces with the upcoming rotation, mostly in the mana base, since all the pain lands are leaving us, although we can potentially replace those with Starting Town, which is pretty good for these aggressive 3-color decks. Recommission also rotates out, but can pretty easily be replaced by Call a Surprise Witness, which has a very similar effect, just trading +1 counter for a flying counter, so that should be a pretty easy swap as well. So yeah, the main question is, can we make the mana base work with the upcoming rotation? But for the next month, this should be one of the best decks as well. Next up we've got the Blue-White or Azorius Artifact archetype, and this one's incredibly scary once it gets a Simulacrum Synthesizer going, generating those huge construct tokens turn after turn, and we can also find Synthesizer by sacrificing a 2-mana artifact to Repurposing Bay, and then the addition of United Battlefront from Tarkir Dragonstorm also gave the deck a significant power boost, so this is also one of the main contenders in the upcoming format, and it doesn't lose much with rotation in in 1 month, just the Might Stone and Weak Stone at 5 mana, which can be pretty easily replaced. And then we've got the Pale Lands, a Darkar Waste leaving us, so that's another card that we can pretty easily do without, but the core of the deck remains the same, just maybe replace the Might Stone with another 5 mana artifact. Next up, we're taking a look at a Monowhite Lifegain, which is a pretty fun, aggressive white deck that's pretty good at beating up on other aggro decks, since we've got all that built-in life gain. At 1 mana, lots of life-linking flyers, and other ways to passively gain life just by playing out our creatures, and then we can grow our 2-drops, a Chinese Pridemate, and Essence Channeler, picking up additional +1 counters whenever we gain life, so that can be multiple counters in 1 turn. Sheltered by Ghosts, an excellent removal spell that also gains us life. And then Linden is more cheap life gain triggers, and sometimes we have a broken opening hand thanks to Leyline of Hope, immediately pumping our creatures and gaining us even more life. The deck currently relies on Knight Errant for card advantage by tapping a bunch of creatures for Convoke, and this is the only card that will leave us with the upcoming rotation, so it will need to replace Knight Errant, maybe with the Exemplar of Light, which is another life gain card that can draw cards, so we'll need to find a replacement for the Knight Errant, but if we find a good replacement, I think this deck will persist. Next up is Monoblack Demons, and I featured almost this exact list about 7 or 8 months ago before the release of Foundations, which did introduce Soulstone Sanctuary as a powerful creature land for the archetype, so that was an easy upgrade. Otherwise it still relies on the same key pieces: Unholy Annex to draw extra cards and maybe drain the opponent if we control a demon, can make a large demon token with a Ritual Chamber, can maybe double its damage output with a Bloodletter, a powerful 4 mana demon from the Lost Caverns, and then the 2-card combo with Bloodletter and Unstoppable Slasher. If we manage to hit the opponent with a Slasher, will still stay in Standard. And then we also have the Disruption from Deep Cavern Bat, as well as Duress, which are also both sticking around, but it does lose a lot of other pieces, mainly at 1 mana. Cut Down, one of the best removal spells in the format, rotates out. I wouldn't be surprised if we see a card like Fatal Push being printed in Edge of Eternities. Would be pretty thematic. Someone getting kicked out of an airlock into outer space would be quite the Fatal Push. But we don't know that for sure, otherwise you can always play Stab at 1 mana, giving a creature -2/-2, not quite as exciting. And then our 2 mana removal will also need to switch around as we lose Annoyance, Go for the Throat, and Sheoldred's Edict. Still have Shoot the Sheriff as a solid 2 mana option. At 3 mana we also lose Liliana of the Veil. That one is mechanically more unique, so harder to replace. And then Archfiend of the Dross at 4 mana, another powerful demon, will also rotate out. But we do have some other powerful demons in the format. Final Fantasy added Demon Wall if we want a more defensive option. If aggro decks are popular, could also go for a more proactive card like the Rakshasa, the 5/5 demon, also very good with a Bloodletter, so we do still have some other demons to choose from. Next up is the Green-White Rabbits deck, and this list is pretty much the exact list I featured in the Bloomborough preview event, so not much has changed. I've just updated the green-white mana base a little bit. The mana base will get a little bit weaker with the upcoming rotation, as we lose Brushland and Razor Verge Thicket, but it should still be functional enough. And then another card we lose is the Knight Errant, which was pretty good for card advantage in a deck that's capable of going wide very quickly to tap creatures for Convoke, but it's not an essential piece. Can always add more Evangelists or War Leaders. There are some other powerful rabbits like the Bunnycorn you could include, which will still stick around. So yeah, Green-White Rabbits, still a powerful go-wide archetype for the upcoming Standard. Now, while Mono-Red has lost a lot of pieces, it's still not a deck you want to underestimate, and the only card it loses in the upcoming rotation is Monastery Swiftspear, which admittedly is a very powerful card, seeing play in every red aggro deck in pretty much every format, but we still have the powerful Hired Claw at 1 mana, so as long as Edge of Eternities introduces another powerful red 1-drop, this deck could survive, now that it's lost the Mouse package, since I don't think you want to be playing Manifold Mouse without a Heart Wildfire hero, only having the Emberheart Challenger as another mouse, but the Challenger is still very good in and of itself as a 2/2 with haste and prowess, can still activate the Rockface Village to trigger Valiant, and then the Hired Claw can also benefit from the haste, and then Screaming Nemesis, one of the best creatures in these red aggro decks, can prevent the opponent from gaining a life, combos with your own Witchstalker Frenzy if you can target it for maybe just 1 mana to deal 5 more damage after having dealt regular combat damage. So still a very powerful deck, still have the Slick Shot to fly over and deal a lot of damage, might need to rely more on burn spells like Bolt Wave to get the job done, but yeah, there's quite a few flex slots as well. So that's Monored Aggro. Next up we have Dinosaur Reanimator, and this one you could go in a lot of different directions, but the main card I want to highlight as being a main role player in Standard is Zombify. 4 mana to return a creature from our graveyard to the battlefield without any drawbacks is a very powerful effect, and while we still have Invasion of Argamon in Standard, this deck can potentially win as early as turn 3 if you're incredibly lucky. Invasion, discard Galta, Stampede, Tyrant. Turn 3, reanimated with Zombify thanks to your treasure token, and then if you have maybe a Hatcher in hand alongside a few more dinosaurs to give them all haste, you could already be attacking for lethal. This deck loses a few pieces in the upcoming rotation, as I've mentioned Invasion of Argamon, which set up the most explosive turn 3 Zombify, probably a good thing that that's no longer an option, but we still have Seize the Spoils to then turn 4 either Zombify or cast a 5 mana reanimation spell like Rakdos Joins Up, which has a few legendary dinosaurs to go with it. Could also play Coiling Rebirth in this deck, which has excellent synergy with the Trumpeting Carnosaur as well as the Hatcher, and even the Voltborn Tyrant is pretty good as a non-legend you can reanimate with a Rebirth. So you've got a lot of options. We also lose Etali at 7 mana with March of the Machine rotating out, but that's also pretty easily replaced with additional Voltborn Tyrants or Gishots. So yeah, this deck remains pretty powerful after rotation. The mana base remains the same as well. So a pretty decent deck to invest in if you like Reanimator decks. Brother's End I guess also rotates out, and that's one of the best cards you have against a blue-white artifact deck, which I expect to see more play as well. So hopefully we'll get some other mass artifact destruction in upcoming Standard expansions. Next up we have the Tyvar Roots deck. Most versions that saw play at Pro Tour were just black-green, but I do want to experiment with a red splash that adds Terra into the mix as another way to mill lots of cards, and the key card we want to find in this deck is Insidious Roots, which is a card that can go pretty crazy, making lots of plant tokens, especially once Tyvar is involved, giving those plant tokens haste, so they can immediately tap for mana, and then cards like the Osteomancer, replaying creatures out of the graveyard, Mold Tender, exiling creatures out of the graveyard, are also very good ways to trigger Insidious Roots and then quickly build up a lethal army of plant tokens. The Soul Cauldron could also be used in combination with some activated abilities, and then we have the Thrill Seeker, which can also maybe deal the final blow once we build up enough plant tokens. But I will say this deck loses a lot of pieces next month with rotation, the main one being Tyvar, since Tyvar plus Roots is the core of the deck, so your plant tokens can no longer go crazy without Tyvar on the battlefield giving them haste, and the mana base also takes a significant hit, losing all the pain lands, even though we do have Starting Town to maybe replace them. So this deck's going to be a lot of fun for the next month, but then you will lose Tyvar, so you'll have to find a different way to combo with your Insidious Roots. Next up we have a control deck for those that like control, and I think a Shiko control deck might be the place to be. I featured a deck very similar to this a few months ago on the channel. The mana base stays the same after rotation. We do lose a couple cards here and there, cards like Brotherhood's End, as I've mentioned earlier, which was a pretty good tool against artifact decks, although at least in white we can still count on Ultima as a board wipe that destroys all artifacts and creatures, as well as ending the turn, so no additional triggers going on the stack afterwards. And then we also lose Temporary Lockdown, but again, that's pretty replaceable with cards like Split Up and potentially other 3-mana sweepers we might get in future expansions. And then at 6 mana, no longer have Chandra as one of your finishers, but that's also not really a staple in the archetype, so can pretty easily do without it. Then going back to Bloomburrow, we have Black-Red Lizards. While the Mouse deck got knocked down a peg, we still have the Rabbit deck, we still have Lizards, and as we'll see in a second, the Black-White Bat archetype I think is still alive and well. So this deck gets to play with a lot of powerful creatures, and I think also has good overlap with the Start Your Engines mechanic. I featured a deck very similar to this a while ago with Aether Drift releasing. So we have a few cards that aren't Lizards with 4 copies of Burnout Bastronaut, which has the Start Your Engines theme, and the Lizards are very good at increasing their speed without necessarily needing to attack with cards like the Vine Lasher with Landfall. Hired Claw is also very good in multiples, and then at 2 mana there's Gev, which can also passively deal damage by just casting more Lizards, and then the Thrill Seeker has perfect overlap between the Start Your Engine theme and the Lizard archetype. We've got Fireglass Mentor for card advantage, Pyromancer as another way to deal damage without needing to attack, the One of Hazoret, another payoff to Start Your Engines, and then the Gecko leading to some very explosive starts as well, with the 1-drops all being very good at enabling it. And then topping off our curve, there's the Valley Flamecaller to enhance our Lizards, and Laughing Jasper, also a nice source of card advantage. And then the mana base gets to play with Rockface Village, as well as Cavern, making our Lizards uncounterable, but we do lose a few lands in the upcoming rotation, Blackleaf Cliffs and Sulphur Springs, and we do not have Blood Crypt in Edge of Eternities, so we'll have to wait a bit longer before Blood Crypt is back in Standard. I'm guessing it will be at some point, so the mana base may not be quite as perfect, but should still be serviceable. And then last but not least, a deck that I will feature on the channel soon, the Black-White Bat archetype with the addition of Dark Confidant, as well as Cecil from Final Fantasy. Both play well in kind of the life gain and drain archetype, where you're losing a bit of life yourself, but you can also make up for it with your life gain effects, like the life-linking Rune Lurker Bat, still have the disruption from Deep Cavern Bat, and then can also gain additional life with Zoralin. And then we basically have 8 Dark Confidants between Dark Confidant himself, and then the Augur also drawing us additional cards, maybe even with Offspring. The curve is pretty low, so we shouldn't lose too much damage to those abilities. Also have the Convocation as another payoff, and then we have some solid removal, although that's where the rotation also hits this archetype as we lose Cut Down. But yeah, again, hopefully we'll get a decent replacement at 1 mana for it. The Betrayal is still kind of a leftover from the previous metagame with Omniscience being popular, but again, graveyard decks with Zombify could also be popular, so I could see a card like Betrayal still being fine in this archetype. And then the mana base, we don't really lose much, just Caves of Koilos, but we will be getting Godless Shrine, so that's also a pretty easy swap. So yeah, that's 13 decks for you to try in the next month as we wait for the upcoming rotation. I've added decklist links in the video description to all of these decks, as well as any relevant video links for videos I might have featured in the past with these decks, and then I'll be sure to make some new videos as well with some of the newer archetypes. So yeah, that's going to do it for today's video. I want to thank you for watching, hope you enjoyed, and as always, have a nice day.